You know, the urge to expand is a very natural one. An individual tries to, continually tries to expand his influence, expand his knowledge. A business, a company does the same thing. Now, remember that nations are a composite of individuals. And many of the individual traits that one finds, one will discover them in a somewhat more, what shall I say, composite or exaggerated degree in nations. Should be no surprise to us at all that nations expand. Sometimes they expand their territories for economic reasons, but other times they expand in order to set a buffer state, which may serve as a basis of defense. There are occasions, too, when a nation will expand, just for the sheer satisfaction of national pride. Now, in this North American story of ours, it again should be no surprise that as soon as the various colonial empires have driven their roots fairly deeply, that little by little they should think of expanding. And that's the story we want to sketch, and we'll have to sketch it, and sketch it very briefly, in this present session. Now, we'll turn attention to the Spaniards first, to the French, and then to the English. The Spaniards are the first on the ground. The Spaniards are beginning to move. They're beginning to move their frontiers by the middle of the 16th century. It's about a century and a half later that the English and the French begin to come into step. Now, in all of these frontier movements, all of these expansionist movements, you have a certain number of key people, a certain number of dominating motives. In instances, they are common denominators. In others, they are peculiar to this or to the other particular empire. Now, take the Spaniards, for example. In the expansion of the Spanish Empire, there are two frontier agents, who are perennially important. One is the miner. The Spanish Empire expands as it searches out new veins, new mines from which to draw its precious metals. Then the other member of the Spanish frontier team is the missionary, because a great number of the Spanish advanced moves are made in function of their desire to win the souls, to convert the natives of the Americas to Christianity. Let's follow them. Let's follow both the Spanish miner and the missionary. Hand in hand they go on toward the north. Now, it's about the middle of the 16th century, after these early exploring expeditions such as De Soto, Coronado, Cabrillo, and Ferrelo have come back and reported rather disappointingly upon the north that the Spaniards now find a new reason for expansion. In the late 40s, up here in central Mexico, this area around here, they make the first of their important mine strikes. And moving out from Zacatecas to Guanajuato, Aguascalientes, San Luis Potosí, Durango, and the like, little by little, the area fills in. Now, accompanying the miners and trying to bring Christianity to these wilder Indians, the so-called Chichimecas, who are in this region, are the Franciscans. And in general, the brown robes do their work in the eastern half of northern and north-central Mexico. Little by little, they work on up to the Rio Grande boundary. We'll put the Rio Grande roughly about in here. They're working up this way. At the end of the century, at the end of the 16th century, they accompany Juan de Oñate as he follows up and in the Pueblo area of New Mexico and of Arizona establishes Spanish control. Now, that's one movement up, so to speak, the eastern half, headed to a very large extent by the Franciscans. In the western half of Mexico, the movement is a combination of the advance of the miner accompanied by the black robes or the Jesuits. At the end of the century, at the end of the 16th century, the Jesuits come out and along the coast here in Sinaloa establish their first mission enterprise. A little bit later, on the other side of the Sierra, see, down through Mexico here, you have this mountain backbone, the Sierra Madre. On the other side of the Sierra, about a couple decades later, another group of Jesuits begin to move up and, little by little, take in the Tepehuan country, then move on up to the Tarahumara country. Along the west coast, you have this gradual advance of this mission frontier. Out of Sinaloa into Sonora, and ultimately it moves on up and crosses the modern Arizona boundary, and there in southern Arizona, the great black robe of the late 17th and the early 18th century, Kino, founds several missions which are well preserved down to the present day. Probably many of you in motoring or in traveling west have had a chance to see one of these great missions to the south of Tucson, Arizona, San Javier del Bac. The site was set up by Kino. The actual church, which you catch in the picture, is of later development under the leadership of the famous Franciscan Garces. In the third quarter of the 18th century, after the Spanish frontier had moved roughly about to here and was beginning to come up the peninsula, the Jesuits, for reasons that we haven't time to discuss here, were asked to, sort of hand in their suits and retire. They had come into difficulty with the King of Spain, and he decided that his empire in the Americas could get along without them. Now, the Franciscans filled in as best they could, as their numbers allowed, the places that were vacated by the Jesuits, and this last move, forward move of the frontier, carries on up into Upper California, Alta California as it was known in those days, and under the leadership of the saintly Junipero Serra, one of the great names in early American history. The line of missions is carried up to and beyond the Golden Gate. Now, while the Spaniards, see, are filling in this region here, up into New Mexico, up to California, and moving over here in the 18th century, they move over into Texas and found their missions. There also are Spanish missions by the Franciscans here in Florida and on up the Georgia coast. So therefore, when we get down to this period when the frictions are going to become somewhat exaggerated, the Spaniards are well established in the Southwest, in California, and in what was known in those days as the Floridas. They generally speak of it in the plural. So here is the Spanish advance. Now, let's turn quickly to the advance of the French. In previous discussions, we've seen how the French established themselves in several spots along the St. Lawrence and began to exploit the fur trade. Then came this very critical period in the story of New France when the French and their Indian allies were attacked by the Iroquois. This, to a very large extent, in the late 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s, cut down the forward drive of the French. However, about the time that the Iroquois operation was being pulled under control, a certain number of adventurous Frenchmen decided that maybe life out here in the wilderness, out here in the West, was much more secure than it was with the threat of the Iroquois constantly hanging over the valley. Some of them began to move out. Now, in the late 50s, two very important Coureurs de Bois, which is the name by which we generally designate the Frenchmen who went out into the wilderness to trade in furs and to explore and so on, two very important men, Radisson and Groseilliers, were out there in the West. They probably got over into Minnesota, and it's perfectly possible that they were among the first white men to see the area around the sources of the Mississippi. From there, they went on up into the Hudson Bay region, and discovered its fur resources. Ultimately, they had difficulty with the French governor of New France in Canada, and they transferred their allegiance and their information to the British, who immediately jumped at the opportunity, established one of the great fur trading companies, the HBC, the Hudson's Bay Company, and began to exploit this area. We'll have an opportunity to say a little something more about the Hudson's Bay Company in one of our subsequent discussions. Now, also coming out to the West at about the same time, let's say in the early 60s, are a certain number of the black robes, the Jesuits. The Jesuits were very strong and important in the Christianization operation in New France. Now, the reason that they're coming out is to try to make contact once again with certain of their former converts who had lived in this Huronia district. Here along Georgian Bay, the mission area that had been broken up by the Iroquois attacks at the end of the decade of the 40s. Now, some of these Hurons had moved on over into the farther lakes and were settled now around Lake Superior. And the missionaries wanted to make contact to reestablish missions with them. And in the 60s, this work was begun. Now, little by little, as they got the Iroquois menace under control, the Frenchmen began to think of extending their fur empire, their mission empire, into the heart of the continent. And at first, there were missions. Then there was talk of great copper mines. And several expeditions went out to try and find the sources of these copper mines. As soon as the Frenchmen got out into the West, there came back to him this story of the great river of the continent. Back in the middle 30s, Jean Nicolet, who had gone out and been the first white man along Lake Michigan, around Green Bay, had brought back the information. He had not been able to follow it up. It was merely a rumor. Then followed the decades during which the Frenchmen, well, they were under pressure. They didn't have either the time, nor did they really have the inclination to move out into the wilderness. And so this rumor of the great river of the West more or less hung, and nobody could tie it down. Now, in the meantime, the Frenchmen had begun to build up a great deal of hope about this great river. They were hoping that possibly it might cut across the continent and empty into what they called the Vermilion Sea, which today we know as the Gulf of California. They were still haunted, they were still obsessed by this idea of a possible water route to the Pacific. Now, in 73, just before, or in 72 actually, just before he leaves for France, the great intendant, Jean Talon, had delegated one of the Frenchmen who had had considerable experience in the West, namely Louis Joliet, to run down this rumor. Joliet comes out along the well-known Ottawa route into the lakes through the Straits of Mackinac, and there he picks up as his companion the renowned Jesuit Jacques Marquette, Father Marquette. And together with a few companions, they set out on one of these romantic searches to run down a rumor. Now, they come to Green Bay and they follow the Fox River to a point where they can pick up their canoes. Remember that canoes in those days were quite light, and very frequently the Frenchmen thought nothing of walking 6, 8, 10 miles from one watercourse to the other, carrying their canoes, then going back and carrying their baggage. These were the portages. And then they dipped their canoes into the Wisconsin. They followed the Wisconsin, and at a site just below the modern Prairie du Chien, the Wisconsin flows into the Mississippi, and they were on the Great River. The story of the progress of Marquette and Joliet down that river is very well known. They made several stops along the way and made friends with the Indians. The Indians of the area gave them what Europeans might call a safe conduct. They gave them the peace pipe and assured them that wherever the Indians would smoke the peace pipe with them, they were among friends. All right, that charm worked until they got down, see, the Mississippi, let's run it roughly this way, until they got down to the mouth of the Arkansas. Oh, beg your pardon, I should say the Arkansas. There's quite a bit of discussion, as you know, as to how that river is to be pronounced, how that name is to be pronounced. A number of the Coloradans call it the Arkansas. By the time it hits the boundaries of the state of Arkansas, by law, it becomes known as the Arkansas. At any rate, they turned back there, but they had picked up sufficient information to blast this hope that the Mississippi flowed into the Gulf of California. By now they knew that it flowed into the Gulf of Mexico. This was somewhat discouraging, but nevertheless, they did recognize that they had an inland waterway of considerable importance. Now, the man who was going to follow up and run the Mississippi to the mouth is one of the great names in North American colonial history, namely La Salle. La Salle had come to France, or come to New France, as a young man. He became interested in making a living. He obtained a tract of land above Montreal, near the rapids, and actually, that's one of the reasons why those rapids above Montreal are called the Lachine Rapids. La Chine in French means China. And La Salle was always talking these grandiose schemes of getting to the east. So the people, more or less in satire, tabbed his seigneury La Chine. Well, at any rate, he was quite friendly with the governor of the day, Count Frontenac, and Frontenac used him as a field man. In the course of his poking around in this region, he probably was down in the Ohio country and learned something about it. Then he obtained permission from the Crown to exploit the fur resources of the area to the south of the lakes. And in process of that, he founded several posts along the Illinois River. By this time, he was beginning to develop an idea. The idea was this: if the French can set a series of trading posts, a series of forts, down through the heart of this continent, then they may be able to contain the English. See, you have the wall of the Appalachians here. They may be able to keep the English on the Atlantic side of the mountains and leave the whole of the Central Valley under French control for French exploitation and settlement and so on. Now, in order to have his facts clearly, or at his fingers' tips, he decided that what he should do is go clear to the mouth of the Mississippi, which in 1682 he does. And there, in a ceremony, a rather typical French ceremony, at the mouth of the Mississippi, he erects a cross and on the cross hangs the royal arms of France, and then proclaims to anybody who's willing to listen, mostly the birds and so on, a few Indians are around, that this belongs to His Majesty Louis XIV of France. Then with this information, LaSalle goes back to France to push his idea of the series of forts which will contain the English. Now that leads him to his unfortunate venture in Texas, where he meets his death. And though his great friend and companion, the man with the iron hand, Tonty, would like to carry on, nevertheless, Tonty is not given permission, and the whole idea is hangs in abeyance for about a decade. Then in 1699, the French then decide to act, and they send an expedition out which establishes French control along the Gulf Coast, first at Biloxi, then they move over to Mobile, then ultimately, in the early part of the 18th century, they decide to make New Orleans, near the mouth, the capital. And at the same time, other Frenchmen, some of them are coming from the Gulf area, some of them are coming out of Canada, and they begin to settle in the heart of the valley in what was known as the Illinois country, Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and so on. So therefore, as the French expand, they take the whole heart of the continent from the lakes, well, from the St. Lawrence Valley out to the lakes, and then on down the Mississippi to its mouth. Now, the English expansion is much less spectacular. The principal motive that the English had for expanding was very much the principal motive which brought Englishmen overseas. The desire for land, better land, cheaper land, more land. And we can, of course, there are elements of the fur trade and the Indian trade mixed up with it, but if you scrape the surface, you'll find that the bulk of the English backwoodsmen who pushed away from the established settlements and went out onto the frontier, out toward the wilderness, that their motivation to a very large extent was to get land. Now, the English are not so much concentrated as the Spaniards are. The Spaniards can start from a small area and expand this way, fan-like. The English, more or less, are going to expand along a long front. One of the earliest examples of expansion is from Massachusetts and Plymouth over into the Connecticut Valley, where they find much better farmland than they had along the coastline. Another important area of expansion is down in the Virginia-Carolina region. Particularly in Virginia, after a time, the intensive tobacco cultivation wore out the land, and since tobacco was their prime crop, and they had to continue to grow it at all costs, little by little, the planters moved closer and closer to the Falls line and then on toward the Piedmont. Now, pursuing the Indian trade, the Carolinians, the South Carolinians particularly, began to edge out here, and at about this point, the Appalachian highland rather dwindles off and merges into the Gulf Plain. They could more or less get around and contact the Indians of this region. Probably the most important of the frontier pushes was that which was beginning to form around Pennsylvania and New York, and was beginning to push out into central Pennsylvania, soon would cross the mountains and flow on down the Ohio, the valley of the Ohio. That will follow, part of that will follow in our next. Now, who went to the frontier among the English? Well, a number of what we might call the little people made up these famous backwoodsmen. People who were somewhat dissatisfied with life as they found it in the settlements along Tidewater. Then later immigrants, English immigrants, and then very particularly the non-Anglo-Saxon immigrants. A great number of Germans, a great number of Scotch-Irish began to come in. They pushed on out to the frontier. And a number of people who had formerly been, but past their early days as indentured servants, after they had served out the term of their indenture, they sought land and opportunity on the frontier. So little by little, the frontiers all along the line are getting much too close to one another for comfort. The French are becoming uneasy about the English are becoming uneasy about the French, the Spanish are becoming uneasy about the English slipping down, about the French encroaching. Friction is in the making. And that's the story of our next discussion. But let's offer a few suggestions for readings on this really fascinating aspect of colonial history. Let me first suggest The Explorers of North America. The Explorers of North America by John Bartlett Brebner, B-R-E-B-N-E-R, professor at Columbia University and one of the great colonial historians. A couple on the Spanish side, Bolton, Herbert E. Bolton, The Spanish Borderlands, and a collection of his essays in which he talks particularly of the work of the mission frontier, Wider Horizons of American History, Bolton, B-O-L-T-O-N. The French story is contained very interestingly in this book by Joseph H. Schlarman, From Quebec to New Orleans. There are dozens of others which we could mention, but actually this will give you a start. Remember, in all of these books, you'll find the works from which the authors themselves drew a good deal of their information, and if you're interested, you can go on and on and on. Now, in our story to date, we've got these empires, and they're practically rubbing shoulders. And pretty soon, we're going to have a bargain counter operation. They're all going to start reaching for the same thing, and you know what happens at bargain counters when too many hands go out, too many shoulders and too many elbows become involved. There's trouble, and there's going to be trouble in our next week's discussion. That's it.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.